Margaret Sullivan received the letter on February 14, 1944, Valentine's Day. She was 18 years old, working the morning shift at a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. The envelope bore an Army Air Force return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Miss Sullivan, I regret to inform you that your brother, Staff Sergeant Daniel Sullivan, waist gunner aboard B-17F, Fighting Irish. He was killed in action over Germany on January 11, 1944. Danny Sullivan died at 25,000 feet, in the back of a bomber surrounded by 9 other crewmen. But he wasn't killed by a German bullet. He wasn't torn apart by flak. A Messerschmitt's cannon didn't end his life. Danny Sullivan died because he couldn't breathe. His oxygen line had been severed during combat maneuvers, not by enemy fire, but by his fellow waist gunners' frantic movements in a space too confined for 2 men to operate without catastrophic interference. Danny collapsed on the metal floor of his aircraft unconscious while fighters pressed their attack and his crewmates fought for survival. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. 4 minutes without oxygen at that altitude means brain death. Danny was 20 years old. His sister would never know the real reason her brother died. The Army's letter cited wounds received in action against the enemy. Technically true, emotionally devastating, practically incomplete. Because Danny Sullivan was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of American airmen who died fighting not just the Luftwaffe, but their own aircraft's design. This is the story of how a seemingly minor engineering oversight, measured in mere feet, created one of World War II's most preventable tragedies, and how a group of unlikely heroes, including civilian women working in a Wyoming aircraft hangar, fixed a problem that the world's largest aircraft manufacturer had missed. Picture a map of England in January 1943. Across East Anglia, 70-some airfields house America's 8th Air Force. Each base operates roughly 40 bombers. Each bomber carries 10 men. Now, watch what happens over the course of a month. January 3rd, 8 bombers lost, 80 men gone. January 13th, 5 bombers, 50 men. January 23rd, 3 bombers, 30 men. January 27th, 3 more bombers attacking Wilhelmshaven. The cumulative effect was devastating, not just in absolute numbers, though those were horrifying enough, but in what it did to unit cohesion, morale, and operational effectiveness. Commanders' conferences became grim statistical exercises. If your group's bombers averaged 11 missions before loss, and that was the actual figure in early 1943, how could you maintain operational strength? How do you ask men to fly 25 missions when mathematics proved most of them wouldn't survive? Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan, who would eventually pilot the Memphis Belle to fame as one of the first B-17s to complete 25 missions, later wrote about those early months. "We didn't talk about odds. We couldn't. If you thought too hard about the numbers, you'd never climb into the aircraft." Across those English bases, young men developed rituals to cope with the constant attrition. Some refused to learn the names of replacement crews. Why get attached to men who'd be gone in 2 weeks? Others became superstitious, wearing the same socks on every mission, carrying photographs, refusing to fly without specific crew members. The psychological toll was immense. Flight surgeons reported epidemic levels of what they called operational fatigue, what modern medicine would recognize as acute stress reaction or combat trauma. Men who'd flown 5, 6, 7 missions showed signs of breakdown. 1,000-yard stares in the officers' club, hands that wouldn't stop shaking, nightmares that made sleep impossible. The physical manifestations of this stress were everywhere. Young men aged years in months, hair turned prematurely gray, weight dropped off frames already lean from rationed food. Some developed ulcers. Others couldn't keep food down before missions. A few broke completely, unable to board their aircraft, led away to hospitals where doctors tried to piece together shattered psyches. The Army called it lack of moral fiber. Modern medicine would recognize it as what happens when you ask human beings to repeatedly face near certain death. And behind all this suffering lay a cruel mathematical truth. American bombers, specifically the B-17 Flying Fortress, had fundamental defensive weaknesses that German fighter pilots were systematically exploiting. The question wasn't whether the bombers could reach their targets and drop bombs. They could. The question was whether enough of them could return home to make the campaign sustainable. And in early 1943, the answer was increasingly becoming no. Group commanders found themselves writing letters to families with disturbing frequency. "Dear Mrs. Anderson, I regret to inform you that your son failed to return from a mission over occupied Europe. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, it is my sad duty to report that your son is missing in action." The letters piled up. The grief spread across America like a slow-moving plague. Small towns lost their sons. Cities mourned their boys. And still the missions continued because there was no other choice. Germany had to be defeated. The bomber offensive had to continue. But something had to change, or the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse under the weight of unsustainable casualties. To understand how America ended up with bombers that killed their own crews, we need to travel back to a different time and place. Maxwell Field, Alabama, 1935. The Army's premier tactical training facility hummed with ambition that year. Young officers debated revolutionary theories about air power. Billy Mitchell had been court-martialed a decade earlier for advocating these ideas too forcefully. Now, his intellectual descendants refined those concepts into doctrine. The Air Corps Tactical School's instructors developed what they called strategic bombardment theory. The concept was seductive. Modern industrial nations depended on complex manufacturing systems. Destroy key nodes, ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants, and the entire war machine collapses. No massive ground invasions. Air power could win wars cleanly, precisely, scientifically. One critical assumption underpinned this theory. Bombers could defend themselves. If you armed bombers heavily enough and flew them in tight defensive formations, their combined firepower would create an impenetrable sphere of 50-caliber death. Fighters attempting to penetrate that defensive fire would be destroyed before reaching effective gun range. This wasn't just wishful thinking. Officers ran calculations. They built scale models. They conducted war games on paper. The math looked good. The theory seemed sound. On paper, in controlled conditions, with assumptions about fighter capabilities and attack patterns and defensive coordination, everything worked perfectly. But theory and reality, as bomber crews would learn at terrible cost, were two very different things. Boeing Aircraft Company's engineers embraced this philosophy completely. When they designed the Model 299, which would evolve into the B-17, they created an aircraft specifically optimized for this theoretical defensive doctrine. Multiple gun positions provided overlapping fields of fire. Turrets could rotate to track targets. Ammunition supplies allowed sustained defensive engagements. The aircraft's very name, Flying Fortress, reflected this defensive philosophy made manifest in aluminum and steel. Progressive models added more guns, more ammunition, more armor. The B-17B had fewer guns than the C model. The D model added more still. By the time the B-17E model entered service in 1941, the aircraft carried 10 50-caliber machine guns positioned throughout the airframe. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. That was an astonishing amount of firepower for a single aircraft. A formation of 18 B-17Es could theoretically put over 100,000 rounds per minute into the sky. What could possibly survive flying into that? German fighters, as it turned out. Experienced German pilots flying advanced aircraft with tactics specifically developed to exploit American defensive weaknesses. The theory had one fatal flaw. It had never been tested against determined, experienced fighter pilots flying advanced aircraft in sustained combat conditions. All those calculations, all those war games, all those confident predictions, they were based on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong when tested against reality. When that test finally came, in the skies over Europe beginning in August 1942, the theory didn't just fail. It collapsed catastrophically. Bomber crews paid for those theoretical failures with their lives. The B-17's defensive armament seemed impressive on inspection, 10 guns covering multiple angles. But German fighter pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of combat hours, quickly identified critical weaknesses. The beam, aviation terminology for the sides of the aircraft, roughly perpendicular to the direction of flight, represented the flying fortress's Achilles heel. Not because those areas lacked guns. The waist positions had two .50 caliber machine guns specifically positioned to defend against beam attacks. The problem was, the men operating those guns couldn't actually function effectively. Picture the interior of a B-17F's fuselage at the waist position. The aircraft's body, roughly cylindrical, measures perhaps 10 feet across at that point. It narrows as you move toward the tail. Two windows, each about 2 feet by 3 feet, open on opposite sides. Two men stand facing each other across this narrow space, each manning a flexible .50 caliber gun. Now add the operational reality. Each man wears multiple layers. Start with long underwear, wool for warmth, then regular uniform, then a heavy sheepskin flight suit, bulky and restrictive. Over that, a flak vest made of overlapping steel plates, weighing 30 pounds. A parachute harness, always worn because you might need to bail out with seconds' notice. Over water, add a Mae West life preserver. Ammunition belts cross over the body, holding hundreds of rounds. Electrical cables connect heated suits to the aircraft's power system. An oxygen hose runs from the aircraft's supply to the mask clamped over nose and mouth. An intercom cable allows crew communication. Multiple layers of gloves protect hands from the cold. Silk gloves under wool gloves, under leather gloves, under electrically heated mittens. Each layer adds bulk. Each connection adds restriction. The result? Two men in a confined space, connected to the aircraft by multiple cables and hoses, trying to swing heavy machine guns to track fast-moving targets, all while not interfering with each other. It was impossible. Sergeant First Class Robert Bobby Hendricks, who flew 17 missions as a waist gunner with the 351st Bomb Group before being transferred to a different position, later recorded his experiences in a diary that his family donated to the Air Force Museum decades after his death. You'd see a fighter coming in from 3 o'clock, diving down toward you. You'd swing your gun to track him, leading the target like they taught you in gunnery school. You'd practice this 100 times on the ground. You knew the sight picture. You knew how to calculate deflection. But Mike, that's Mike Jensen, the other waist gunner, he's tracking a different fighter from 9 o'clock. We'd both pivot at the same instant. Our bodies would collide, hard enough to knock the wind out of you. His oxygen hose would wrap around my leg. My ammunition belt would catch on his gun mount. The empty brass casings rolling around on the floor would trip us up. And in that moment of chaos, both fighters would press their attack, and we couldn't shoot back because we were tangled up with each other like two idiots trying to dance in a phone booth. The diary entries became progressively darker as Hendricks flew more missions. After his 5th mission, he wrote about watching another waist gunner pass out from oxygen deprivation during combat. The man's hose had disconnected when his partner accidentally kicked it during violent evasive maneuvers. By the time anyone noticed, the unconscious gunner had been without oxygen for over 3 minutes. They got his hose reconnected. He regained consciousness. But he was never quite right after that. Slurred speech. Difficulty with coordination. The doctors called it hypoxic brain injury. The crew called it a tragedy. The man was 21 years old and would spend the rest of his life in veterans' hospitals. The environmental conditions transformed this design flaw from an inconvenience into a killer. At 25,000 feet, atmospheric pressure drops to roughly a third of sea level. The air is too thin to support human life without supplemental oxygen. Without it, useful consciousness lasts about 30 seconds. Maybe a minute if you're young and fit and lucky. After that, you pass out. After 4 minutes, brain cells begin dying from oxygen starvation. After 6 minutes, permanent brain damage becomes likely. After 10 minutes, you're dead. Every waist gunner knew this. It was drilled into them during training. Check your oxygen. Watch your buddy's oxygen. If the hose disconnects, you have seconds to reconnect it. Seconds, not minutes. Seconds. But when German fighters bore in from multiple angles, when your job was to track and engage those targets, when your entire focus narrowed to putting rounds into a Messerschmitt 109's engine before his 20mm cannon tore your aircraft apart, in those moments, you didn't notice your oxygen hose getting stepped on. You didn't feel it disconnect. You just kept fighting until your vision started tunneling from the edges, until the gray closed in from all sides, until your fingers weakened on the gun grips and you couldn't understand why the sky was spinning. And then you collapsed unconscious, and whether you lived or died depended entirely on whether your crewmates noticed before your brain cells started dying. The cold amplified every problem. Temperatures at bombing altitude regularly dropped to 50, 60, even 65 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That's cold enough to cause frostbite in exposed skin within seconds. Cold enough to freeze gun mechanisms solid. Cold enough to make ammunition belts stiff and prone to jamming. Cold enough to turn metal surfaces into freezing hazards that would rip skin off if touched with bare hands. The waist positions were fully exposed to the slipstream. Open windows, no protection. 200-mile-per-hour winds screaming through with the force of a hurricane. The wind chill at that speed and temperature was beyond anything most people could imagine. Stand outside in winter. Now add hurricane-force winds. Now subtract another 30 degrees. That's what waist gunners endured for hours at a time during missions deep into Germany. Their electrically heated suits helped when they worked, but the heating elements often failed. Wires broke. Connections came loose. Thermostats malfunctioned. When your heated suit failed at altitude, you had perhaps 30 minutes before cold became dangerous. After an hour, frostbite became likely. After 2 hours, you were in serious trouble. And missions to targets deep in Germany lasted 5, 6, 7 hours or more. Gunners lost fingers and toes to frostbite on almost every mission. Some lost entire hands or feet. A few died from hypothermia, their bodies unable to maintain core temperature, despite every layer of clothing and equipment designed to keep them warm. Mission. Reports from early 1943 documented the crisis with bureaucratic understatement that masked human tragedy. Aircraft 338, unable to effectively engage fighters attacking from beam due to equipment interference at waist positions. Translation, the waist gunners were tangled up with each other and couldn't shoot back. The aircraft was shot down. 10 men died, some in the aircraft, some while parachuting into captivity, some in German prison camps, all dead because 2 men couldn't operate in the same space without catastrophic interference. Aircraft 729 reported oxygen system malfunction at waist position during combat engagement. Translation, somebody's oxygen line got disconnected during the chaos of battle. They suffocated, probably unconscious within a minute, dead within 5. Their crewmates watched helplessly, too busy fighting for their own survival to notice until it was too late. Multiple aircraft reported coordination difficulties among waist gunners during evasive maneuvers. Translation, when pilots threw their bombers into violent turns to avoid flak or fighters, the waist gunners collided, their equipment tangled, and they became combat ineffective precisely when defensive fire mattered most. Luftwaffe pilots weren't stupid. They noticed these patterns quickly. They were professionals. Many had been flying combat since the Spanish Civil War in 1936. They'd fought in Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, Russia. They knew how to analyze enemy weaknesses and develop tactics to exploit them. And they recognized that American bomber waist positions were fundamentally flawed. German fighter tactics evolved specifically to exploit the B-17's beam vulnerability. Instead of attacking from ahead or behind where power turrets provided strong defensive fire, experienced pilots approached from 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Angles where waist gunners bore primary defensive responsibility. angles where American gunners were most likely to be tangled up with each other, unable to coordinate their fire, unable to bring effective defensive fire to bear on attacking fighters. Hauptmann Egon Meyer, commanding officer of the 3rd Group of Fighter Wing 2, pioneered aggressive beam attack techniques in late 1942 and early 1943. His after-action reports, captured after the war and translated by Allied intelligence, revealed systematic analysis of American defensive weaknesses. The American bombardment aircraft exhibits notably reduced defensive effectiveness when engaged from beam angles, particularly when multiple fighters coordinate attacks from opposite sides simultaneously. Waist gun positions demonstrate irregular fire patterns consistent with crew coordination difficulties. We have observed American gunners frequently become entangled with each other during simultaneous engagements from port and starboard beams. This creates windows of vulnerability lasting 5 to 15 seconds, more than sufficient time for a determined pilot to close range and deliver fatal strikes. Recommend all units prioritize beam attacks when tactical situation permits. In other words, attack from the sides, especially from both sides at once, and the American gunners fall apart. This wasn't just academic analysis. German pilots used this knowledge to kill Americans, and they were very, very good at their jobs. By September 1942, before the casualty rates reached crisis levels, but when the trend was already clear, senior officers at Army Air Force headquarters faced an uncomfortable truth. Their bombers needed fighter escorts, and they didn't have fighters capable of providing that escort deep into Germany. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, America's frontline fighter in Europe, was magnificent in many ways. Fast, rugged, heavily armed, able to absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. But it couldn't fly deep into Germany. Range limitations meant P-47s could maybe, on a very good day with perfect conditions, reach the German border. Then they had to turn back, fuel tanks nearly empty, leaving the bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone over the target and during the long flight home. The North American P-51 Mustang, which would eventually solve this problem and become arguably the finest fighter aircraft of World War II, existed only as a promising prototype in late 1942. The marriage of American airframe design and British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that would create the long-range fighter, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, was still being developed, tested, refined, and prepared for mass production. That would take time, months, maybe a year or more. The bomber offensive couldn't wait. Men were dying now. Something had to bridge that gap. Immediately. Not next year. Not next month. Now. Project YB-40 emerged from this desperation. The concept was simultaneously brilliant and insane. Take a standard B-17 Flying Fortress, remove its bomb-carrying capacity, stuff it full of additional guns and ammunition, armor plate everything that could be armored, and use it as a flying escort specifically designed to shoot down German fighters. A bomber that didn't drop bombs. A gunship that existed solely to protect other bombers. Lieutenant Colonel Fred Castle, assigned to evaluate the concept, later described his first reaction in a letter to his wife. My initial thought was that it was the craziest idea I'd heard since someone suggested we could bomb Germany in daylight without fighter protection. My second thought was, God help us, we're desperate enough that this might actually get approved. His wife kept that letter. After Castle was killed in action on Christmas Eve, 1944, she donated his papers to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Researchers found his assessment of the YB-40 program remarkably prescient. The program did get approved. Vega Aircraft Corporation, a subsidiary of Lockheed, received the initial contract for 20 service test aircraft designated YB-40. plus 4 training variants designated TB-40. When Vega became overwhelmed with other high-priority production projects, the YB-40 assembly job was transferred to Douglas Aircraft's Modification Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The modifications were extensive and imaginative. Engineers essentially asked themselves a simple question: how much firepower can we physically fit on a B-17 airframe? The answer, as it turned out, was a lot. A second Sperry dorsal turret was installed in what had been the radio operator's compartment, giving the YB-40 two rotating ball turrets on top of the fuselage instead of one. The Bendix chin turret, a powered twin 50 caliber mount installed under the nose, provided concentrated forward firepower that standard B-17s lacked. Some experimental variants received 4 gun turrets in the nose and tail. A few even carried 40mm autocannons, though these proved too heavy and created too much recoil to be practical. The waist positions got twin gun mounts instead of singles. Now, instead of 250 caliber guns defending the beam, there were 4. On paper, this doubled the defensive firepower at the aircraft's most vulnerable point. The bomb bay, normally loaded with high explosive ordnance, was converted to a massive ammunition magazine, 11,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. That's roughly 3 tons of bullets, enough for sustained engagements against multiple attackers, enough to keep all those guns firing for extended periods. Or so the theory went. Additional armor plating protected crew positions. If this aircraft was going to deliberately draw fighter attacks to protect the regular bombers, it needed to survive hits that would down a standard B-17. All these modifications came at a cost. Weight. The YB-40 weighed over 10,000 pounds more than a standard B-17F. That's the equivalent of carrying an extra medium-sized car inside your bomber, or roughly the weight of 5 Volkswagen Beetles. That much additional weight affected everything: takeoff performance, climb rate, maximum altitude, cruising speed, fuel consumption, maneuverability. Every aspect of aircraft performance degraded under that massive weight penalty. And crucially, almost as an afterthought during the modification process, some YB-40s had their waist gun windows staggered. The left window moved forward several feet. The right window moved aft by a similar amount. This gave each gunner their own operating space, rather than forcing them to work directly opposite each other in that impossibly confined area. This seemingly minor detail, barely mentioned in the initial modification specifications, would prove more important than anyone realized at the time. The first 13 YB-40s arrived at RAF Alconbury, England, in May 1943, assigned exclusively to the 92nd Bomb Group's 327th Bombardment Squadron. Training began immediately, and immediately, problems emerged. The YB-40 crews discovered during training exercises what engineers had missed during the modification design process. Adding more guns to the waist positions didn't solve the fundamental problem. It made it worse. Twin gun mounts took up more space than single mounts. They required more ammunition, meaning more heavy belts snaking across the floor between the gunner positions. They generated more spent brass casings that had to be managed, creating additional tripping hazards in an already confined space. And they still placed 2 gunners in the same impossibly narrow section of fuselage. Even with staggered windows on some aircraft, the twin mounts created enough additional complications that defensive effectiveness remained questionable during training flights. But momentum carried the program forward. Resources had been committed. Aircraft had been modified at considerable expense. Crews had been trained, and the bomber offensive desperately needed something, anything, to stem the casualty hemorrhage that was threatening to make the entire strategic bombing campaign unsustainable. May 29, 1943. Mission to the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. 7 YB-40s accompanied 96 standard B-17s on the first operational test of the gunship concept. Captain Harold Smeltzer, piloting YB-40 number 425737, nicknamed Boomerang, later described the mission in a report to his commanding officer. We struggled from the moment we started engines. That extra weight was immediately apparent. We needed more runway for takeoff. We climbed slower than the standard bombers, forcing the formation to throttle back to keep us in position. We burned more fuel just maintaining formation speed. Once we crossed into enemy territory, the real problem became obvious. We wallowed through the sky like a pregnant whale. Any evasive maneuvering was sluggish and unresponsive. We could shoot, and we did shoot, but we couldn't dodge. If a fighter pressed an attack, our best defense was putting enough rounds into him to make him break off before his rounds found us. We couldn't outmaneuver anybody. Over the target, YB-40s engaged German fighters with their enhanced armament. Claims were filed by gunners. 2 enemy fighters destroyed. 3 damaged. Though such claims were notoriously difficult to confirm in the chaos of aerial combat. Gun camera footage often showed strikes on enemy aircraft, but couldn't definitively prove destruction. The enhanced firepower did seem to have some psychological effect. German fighters appeared more cautious when approaching formations that included the heavily armed YB-40s. But the real disaster came after the bomb run, when standard B-17s dropped their ordnance and the fundamental flaw in the YB-40 concept revealed itself. Standard B-17s carried roughly 6,000 pounds of bombs, depending on mission profile, target distance, and fuel load requirements. When those bombs dropped away, the aircraft suddenly became 6,000 pounds lighter. 6,000 pounds is a massive weight change for an aircraft. Lighter meant they could fly faster, climb higher, maneuver better, turn tighter, respond quicker to control inputs. Every aspect of performance improved dramatically the moment the bombs fell away. YB-40s carried no bombs. They couldn't. Their bomb bays were full of ammunition. They remained at maximum gross weight throughout the entire mission. From takeoff to landing, they were as heavy as they would ever be. And they couldn't keep up with the bombers they were supposed to protect. The escorts fell behind the bombers they were designed to defend. The very aircraft they'd been modified to protect left them struggling in their wake. Lieutenant James Murphy, co-pilot on a standard B-17F nicknamed Irish Luck, watched this unfold from his right seat position. After we dropped our bombs on the target, I felt the aircraft lighten up immediately. The pilot pushed the throttles forward, and we started climbing, picking up speed, getting altitude and distance from the flak bursts still blossoming below us. I looked back through the cockpit windows at our formation and saw the YB-40s struggling to stay with us. Within 10 minutes, maybe 15, they'd fallen a quarter-mile behind the main formation. German fighters saw it too. They weren't blind. They recognized opportunity when it presented itself. A heavily armed bomber falling behind the formation, unable to keep up, isolated and vulnerable despite all those guns. Easy target. Post-mission debriefings revealed another persistent problem. The waist gun issue remained unsolved despite the modifications. Combat reports noted crew coordination challenges at waist positions during engagement with enemy fighters. Translation: under the stress of actual combat, with fighters attacking from multiple angles, with the aircraft maneuvering violently, gunners still couldn't work effectively in that cramped space. The staggered windows helped marginally, but the twin gun mounts created enough additional problems that the net improvement was minimal at best. Over the next month, YB-40s flew additional combat missions. Targets included Le Mans, Villacoublay, Nantes, and other locations across occupied France and Germany. Each mission revealed the same fundamental problems. The aircraft were too heavy to maintain formation after standard bombers dropped their loads. Defensive effectiveness remained questionable. The concept, while innovative, wasn't working as intended. Then came June 22, 1943, and a mission that would effectively end the YB-40 program. The briefing room at RAF Alconbury was packed that morning. 235 heavy bombers would participate in this major strike. 11 of them were YB-40 gunships. The target, IG Farben Industries' synthetic rubber plant at Hüls, Germany. Intelligence officers explained the significance. Nazi Germany's access to natural rubber from Southeast Asia had been severed by Allied control of that region. They'd compensated by building massive synthetic rubber plants, using complex chemical processes to create artificial rubber from coal and petroleum products. This single facility at Hulls produced a substantial percentage of their total synthetic rubber output. Destroy it, and you cripple their ability to manufacture tires for trucks, aircraft, tanks, virtually every vehicle in their military machine. It would be a deep penetration mission. Heavy opposition was expected. Luftwaffe fighter response would likely be intense. Flak concentrations around the target would be heavy. YB-40, number 425735, nicknamed Wango Wango by its crew, carried 10 men instead of the standard bomber complement of 9. All volunteers, all knowing they'd be flying the most heavily armed but also the slowest, most vulnerable aircraft in the entire formation. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 8:30 hours. Climbing to operational bombing altitude of 25,000 feet, they drove deep into German airspace. The Luftwaffe response was immediate, massive, and coordinated. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s from multiple fighter groups converged on the bomber stream like wolves sensing wounded prey. Jagdgeschwader 1, JG 11, JG 26, some of the most experienced and successful fighter units in the German Air Force launched waves of coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm American defensive fire through sheer numbers and tactical coordination. Combat at that altitude, at that intensity, defies easy description for anyone who hasn't experienced it. Imagine tracers arcing through space in streams of light, aircraft corkscrewing through violent, evasive maneuvers that threw men against bulkheads and stressed airframes to their structural limits. The hammering vibration of 50-caliber guns firing continuously. The deeper, more ominous boom of German 20mm and 30mm cannon. Bombers trailing smoke from damaged engines. Fighters spinning down in flames, their pilots bailing out or riding their doomed aircraft down. Parachutes blossoming white against impossibly blue sky. Men falling, men dying. Men fighting desperately to survive the next 30 seconds, the next minute, the next attack run. Wango Wango fought desperately with everything it had. The enhanced armament blazed away continuously. The double dorsal turrets rotated smoothly, tracking targets, sending streams of 50-caliber fire at attacking fighters. The chin turret engaged fighters making frontal attacks head-on. The waist guns hammered at aircraft approaching from the beam in coordinated side attacks. Every gun position fought with everything they had. But in that narrow fuselage, with German fighters pressing attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, with the aircraft maneuvering violently to evade, the waist gunners struggled with the same fundamental problems that had plagued every B-17 since the beginning. They collided during simultaneous engagements. Ammunition belts from the twin mounts tangled with each other. Spent brass casings rolled underfoot. In the critical moments when coordination mattered most, when fighters bore in from both sides at once, defensive fire became ragged, uncoordinated, less effective than it should have been. Anti-aircraft batteries around Hulls opened up as the formation reached the target area. German 88mm flak guns, perhaps the most effective anti-aircraft weapon of the war, filled the sky with black puffs of explosive death. Each burst sent supersonic shrapnel in every direction. Hit one engine and you might limp home. Hit two and you were probably going down. Hit a fuel tank and the resulting explosion would vaporize the aircraft and everyone inside in an instant. Wango Wango took multiple flak hits. Exact damage was impossible to assess in the chaos, but witnesses from other aircraft reported seeing smoke trailing from one engine. Then Unteroffizier Bernhard Kunze, a 23-year-old pilot from Jagdgeschwader 1 flying a Focke-Wulf 190A, pressed his attack with the determination of an experienced fighter pilot who recognized a wounded bomber. Approaching from the beam, specifically targeting the angle where the waist guns should have provided strongest defense, where American gunners should have been able to deliver coordinated, concentrated defensive fire, Kunze found the opening he needed. His 20mm cannons, 4 of them mounted in the wings of his Focke-Wulf, found their mark. Critical systems failed throughout the bomber: hydraulics, electrical, control surfaces. The aircraft's ability to maintain controlled flight became compromised. Flames erupted from the escorts fell behind the bombers they were designed to defend. The very aircraft they'd been modified to protect left them struggling in their wake. Lieutenant James Murphy, co-pilot on a standard B-17F nicknamed Irish Luck, watched this unfold from his right seat position. After we dropped our bombs on the target, I felt the aircraft lighten up immediately. The pilot pushed the throttles forward, and we started climbing, picking up speed, getting altitude and distance from the flak bursts still blossoming below us. I looked back through the cockpit windows at our formation and saw the YB-40s struggling to stay with us. Within 10 minutes, maybe 15, they'd fallen a quarter-mile behind the main formation. German fighters saw it too. They weren't blind. They recognized opportunity when it presented itself. A heavily armed bomber falling behind the formation, unable to keep up, isolated and vulnerable despite all those guns. Easy target. Post-mission debriefings revealed another persistent problem. The waist gun issue remained unsolved despite the modifications. Combat reports noted crew coordination challenges at waist positions during engagement with enemy fighters. Translation: under the stress of actual combat, with fighters attacking from multiple angles, with the aircraft maneuvering violently, gunners still couldn't work effectively in that cramped space. The staggered windows helped marginally, but the twin gun mounts created enough additional problems that the net improvement was minimal at best. Over the next month, YB-40s flew additional combat missions. Targets included Le Mans, Villacoublay, Nantes, and other locations across occupied France and Germany. Each mission revealed the same fundamental problems. The aircraft were too heavy to maintain formation after standard bombers dropped their loads. Defensive effectiveness remained questionable. The concept, while innovative, wasn't working as intended. Then came June 22, 1943, and a mission that would effectively end the YB-40 program. The briefing room at RAF Alconbury was packed that morning. 235 heavy bombers would participate in this major strike. 11 of them were YB-40 gunships. The target: IG Farben Industries' synthetic rubber plant at Hüls, Germany. Intelligence officers explained the significance. Nazi Germany's access to natural rubber from Southeast Asia had been severed by Allied control of that region. They'd compensated by building massive synthetic rubber plants, using complex chemical processes to create artificial rubber from coal and petroleum products. This single facility at Hüls produced a substantial percentage of their total synthetic rubber output. Destroy it, and you cripple their ability to manufacture tires for trucks, aircraft, tanks, virtually every vehicle in their military machine. It would be a deep penetration mission. Heavy opposition was expected. Luftwaffe fighter response would likely be intense. Flak concentrations around the target would be heavy. YB-40, number 425735, nicknamed Wango Wango by its crew, carried 10 men instead of the standard bomber complement of 9. All volunteers, all knowing they'd be flying the most heavily armed but also the slowest, most vulnerable aircraft in the entire formation. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 8:30 hours. Climbing to operational bombing altitude of 25,000 feet, they drove deep into German airspace. The Luftwaffe response was immediate, massive, and coordinated. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s from multiple fighter groups converged on the bomber stream like wolves sensing wounded prey. Jagdgeschwader 1, JG 11, JG 26, some of the most experienced and successful fighter units in the German Air Force launched. Waves of coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm American defensive, fire through sheer numbers and tactical coordination. Combat at that altitude, at that intensity, defies easy description for anyone who hasn't experienced it. Imagine tracers arcing through space in streams of light. aircraft corkscrewing through violent evasive maneuvers that threw men against bulkheads and stressed airframes to their structural limits. The hammering vibration of 50 caliber guns firing continuously. The deeper, more ominous boom of German 20mm and 30mm cannon. Bombers trailing smoke from damaged engines. Fighters spinning down in flames, their pilots bailing out or riding their doomed aircraft down. Parachutes blossoming white against impossibly blue sky. Men falling, men dying, men fighting desperately to survive the next 30 seconds, the next minute, the next attack run. Wango fought desperately with everything it had. The enhanced armament blazed away continuously. The double dorsal turrets rotated smoothly, tracking targets, sending streams of 50 caliber fire at attacking fighters. The chin turret engaged fighters making frontal attacks head-on. The waist guns hammered at aircraft approaching from the beam in coordinated side attacks. Every gun position fought with everything they had. But in that narrow fuselage, with German fighters pressing attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, with the aircraft maneuvering violently to evade, the waist gunners struggled with the same fundamental problems that had plagued every B-17 since the beginning. They collided during simultaneous engagements. Ammunition belts from the twin mounts tangled with each other. Spent brass casings rolled underfoot. In the critical moments when coordination mattered most, when fighters bore in from both sides at once, defensive fire became ragged, uncoordinated, less effective than it should have been. Anti-aircraft batteries around hulls opened up as the formation reached the target area. German 88mm flak guns, perhaps the most effective anti-aircraft weapon of the war, filled the sky with black puffs of explosive death. Each burst sent supersonic shrapnel in every direction. Hit one engine and you might limp home. Hit two and you were probably going down. Hit a fuel tank and the resulting explosion would vaporize the aircraft and everyone inside in an instant. Wango took multiple flak hits. Exact damage was impossible to assess in the chaos, but witnesses from other aircraft reported seeing smoke trailing from one engine. Then Unteroffizier Bernhard Kunze, a 23-year-old pilot from Jagdgeschwader 1 flying a Focke-Wulf 190A, pressed his attack with the determination of an experienced fighter pilot who recognized a wounded bomber. Approaching from the beam, specifically targeting the angle where the waist guns should have provided strongest defense, where American gunners should have been able to deliver coordinated, concentrated defensive fire, Kunze found the opening he needed. His 20mm cannons, 4 of them mounted in the wings of his Focke-Wulf, found their mark. Critical systems failed throughout the bomber. Hydraulics, electrical, control surfaces. The aircraft's ability to maintain controlled flight became compromised. Flames erupted from damaged fuel lines, spreading quickly through the aircraft's interior. The order came from the pilot. The words every bomber crewman dreaded hearing. "Bail out! Bail out! Bail out!" 10 men abandoned their aircraft over enemy territory. 10 parachutes deployed successfully. 10 men drifted down toward German-held ground, toward captivity, toward years in prisoner-of-war camps. All survived the combat engagement itself. None would survive the war with their freedom intact. Some would survive their imprisonment and return home after the war ended. Others would die in those camps from disease, malnutrition, or mistreatment. Wango crashed near the town of Pont, Germany. 1 YB-40 lost to enemy action. The only YB-40 ever shot down during the entire program. But that single loss, combined with all the other problems the program had revealed, was enough. After-action reports from the Holes mission filled dozens of pages with technical details, crew observations, and tactical analysis. Multiple aircraft, both YB-40s and standard B-17s, reported identical problems. Waist gunners unable to coordinate effective defensive fire during beam attacks. Equipment interference at waist positions. Oxygen system complications during violent maneuvering. The same fundamental problems that had existed since the first B-17s flew combat over Europe. By late July 1943, just 2 months after the program began, the YB-40 program was quietly terminated. 59 combat sorties had been flown. 5 confirmed German fighter kills were claimed, with 2 additional probable kills. 1 aircraft lost. The gunship concept had failed to provide the solution commanders so desperately needed. But something crucial had been learned from the failure. Something that would prove far more important than the YB-40 program itself. Engineers analyzing the detailed mission reports noticed something significant buried in the mass of technical data and crew observations. Aircraft equipped with staggered waist windows reported marginally better crew coordination than those with standard opposite window configurations. It wasn't enough to save the YB-40 program. The weight penalty and performance problems were insurmountable, but it was enough to spark an idea. What if instead of creating specialized gunship escorts that couldn't keep up with the bombers they were supposed to protect, they simply improved the standard bombers themselves? What if that simple modification, offsetting the waist positions by just a few feet, could solve the fundamental problem that had been killing American airmen since the beginning of the bomber offensive? The summer of 1943 found engineers across multiple facilities wrestling with the same question. How do you fix the B-17's beam defense vulnerability without creating more problems than you solve? At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, military engineers analyzed combat statistics with mathematical precision, looking for patterns in the losses, correlations between aircraft configurations and survival rates. At Boeing Plant 2 in Seattle, Chief Designer Edward Curtis Wells assembled specialized teams to evaluate potential modifications, weighing the benefits of improved defensive capability against the costs of implementing changes to an aircraft already in mass production. At Douglas Aircraft's facility in Tulsa, Oklahoma, workers who had built the YB-40s suggested various improvements based on their first-hand experience with the modifications. But the most important work happened at a facility that most Americans, even those following the war closely, had never heard of. United Airlines Modification Center Number 10, located at Cheyenne Municipal Airport, Wyoming. Cheyenne, Wyoming, population 27,000 in 1943. A railroad town on the High Plains, better known for cattle ranching, rodeos, and the Transcontinental Railroad than for saving the air war over Europe. But Cheyenne had become absolutely critical to American bomber operations through an accident of corporate history and fortunate geography. United Airlines, before the war, had established Cheyenne as their primary maintenance hub for transcontinental operations. The city's location on the main east-west route made it ideal for aircraft servicing. The High Plains offered reliable flying weather year-round, with fewer fog delays than coastal facilities. United had invested heavily in the infrastructure, multiple massive hangars, trained mechanics, sophisticated testing equipment, machine shops capable of precision work. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Force recognized they had a significant problem that needed solving immediately. Boeing's factories in Seattle, Douglas's facilities in Long Beach and Tulsa, and Lockheed Vega's plants in Burbank were all running at absolute maximum capacity, building bombers as fast as humanly possible. Assembly lines ran 3 shifts around the clock. New B-17s rolled out daily. But combat experience in Europe was generating a constant, ever-increasing stream of improvement recommendations. Engineers identified needed modifications weekly, sometimes daily. Every combat report suggested changes. Every loss analysis pointed to potential improvements. Every crew debriefing revealed new problems that needed addressing. Stopping production lines to incorporate these changes was unthinkable. Every day the factories stood idle meant bombers not built, missions not flown, targets not struck, pressure not maintained on German industry. The solution that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Modification centers. Bombers would leave the factories with basic equipment. the minimum necessary to fly the aircraft safely from the factory to the modification facility. They'd be delivered to strategically located modification centers where the latest combat-proven improvements would be installed before the aircraft deployed overseas to operational squadrons. 5. Major modification centers were established across the continental United States, each specializing in different aspects of bomber modification. But Cheyenne became the largest, most productive, and ultimately most important of all the modification facilities. By spring 1943, 1,600 workers labored at the Cheyenne facility on any given day. 1,600 civilians, many of them women who had never worked outside the home before the war, most with absolutely no aircraft experience before Pearl Harbor. Now they were processing 6 B-17 flying fortresses per day through complex modification upgrades, working with precision tools, reading technical blueprints, making decisions that would directly impact whether American aircrew lived or died. Jean Harmon was 19 years old when she started working at the Cheyenne Modification Center in April 1943. Before the war, she'd worked as a waitress at a diner downtown, serving breakfast to railroad workers and lunch to local businessmen. Her father ran a small cattle ranch outside town. She'd grown up around horses and cattle and wide-open spaces. She'd never seen an airplane up close before her first day at the Modification Center. In an interview recorded in 1997, more than 50 years after the war, she described her experience with remarkable clarity and emotion. They gave us 2 weeks of training before we touched an actual aircraft. How to read blueprints and technical drawings. How to use rivet guns and pneumatic tools. Safety procedures and quality control standards. Then they put us on the production line and expected us to do the job right the first time. Every time. We worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Sundays off for church and rest. My first day on an actual B-17, I was terrified I'd mess something up, and some pilot would die because of my mistake, because I'd driven a rivet crooked or failed to tighten a bolt properly. The foreman, Mr. Erickson, he gathered all us new workers together that first morning and told us something I never forgot. Every rivet you set, every bolt you tighten, every connection you make, you're saving American lives. Don't forget that. Never forget that. Those boys are depending on you to do your job right. Don't let them down. W.W. Erickson. William Wallace Erickson, though everyone just called him W.W. United Airlines engineer, assigned to lead the Cheyenne modification program. His name appears in very few history books. No monuments commemorate his work. No airports bear his name. Most Americans have never heard of him. But his decisions, his leadership, his willingness to take responsibility for implementing untested modifications on America's most important heavy bomber would save thousands of lives over the course of the war. Erickson's team analyzed the YB-40 combat reports with particular attention to the persistent waste gun problems that had plagued the program from the beginning. They interviewed returning crews whenever possible, asking detailed questions about what worked and what didn't, what helped and what hindered their ability to defend their aircraft effectively. They built full-scale mock-ups of waste gun positions with different configurations, testing them with actual gunners wearing full combat gear, simulating the restricted space and difficult conditions. They calculated optimal spacing between gun positions, measuring angles of fire, fields of view, room for movement. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Move the left waist window forward by 3 feet. Move the right window aft by 3 feet. Give each gunner their own operating zone, their own space to work without constantly colliding with their partner. No major structural redesign needed. No complex engineering challenges to solve. No exotic materials or manufacturing processes required. Just cut new windows in slightly different positions along the fuselage, cover the old window openings with aluminum patches, install new gun mounts at the new locations. The modification could be completed in a few days per aircraft with the workers and tools already available at the modification center. But simple doesn't mean easy, especially when you're in the middle of a war and the stakes involve thousands of lives. Someone had to take responsibility for altering the design of America's primary heavy bomber, an aircraft that had been in production for years, that had been tested extensively, that had been approved by the Army Air Force, and was being built by 3 separate manufacturers. Someone had to certify that this modification would actually work in combat, that it wouldn't create new problems worse than the ones it solved. Someone had to sign their name on official documents guaranteeing that thousands of aircraft would be permanently changed based on this design, that production lines would be altered, that resources would be committed to implementing this modification across the entire B-17 fleet. Erickson took that responsibility without hesitation. July 1943. The first B-17, with experimentally staggered waist windows, modified at the Cheyenne facility under Erickson's direct supervision, was shipped to England for operational combat testing with a frontline bomber group. The aircraft went to the 384th Bomb Group stationed at Grafton Underwood, a group with extensive combat experience and a reputation for detailed, accurate after-action reporting. Crews were thoroughly briefed on the experimental nature of the modification. This is experimental equipment. We need you to pay attention to everything. Document every detail of how it performs in actual combat conditions. We need to know if this works, if it helps, if it creates any new problems we haven't anticipated. Your observations will determine whether we implement this modification across the entire fleet. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford drew the assignment for the first combat mission with the experimentally modified aircraft. He was an experienced pilot, with 15 missions already completed. Enough combat time to have a solid understanding of what worked and what didn't in actual operations. His regular waist gunners, Sergeants Mike Patterson and Joe Kowalski, both experienced aerial gunners with multiple combat missions under their belts, would operate the new staggered waist gun configuration and provide detailed feedback on its effectiveness. Patterson later described his first impression of the modified positions in a letter home to his wife that she kept for decades. I walked back to my position and thought there'd been a mistake, that they'd installed my gun in the wrong place. The window wasn't where it should be, where it had always been on every B-17 I'd ever flown in. It was forward, much closer to the radio room than normal. Then I looked across at Joe's position on the other side of the fuselage. His window was aft, toward the tail section. We stood in our positions, and I suddenly understood what they'd done. We're not standing right across from each other anymore. There's actual space between us. Real space where we can move without hitting each other. I could walk from my position to his without bumping into him. We could both swing our guns through their full range of motion at the same time without our bodies colliding. For the first time since I started flying combat as a waist gunner, I felt like I had room to actually do my job properly. The mission itself was what crews called a milk run by late 1943 standards, attacking a Luftwaffe airfield in occupied France. Limited opposition expected based on intelligence reports. No deep penetration into heavily defended German airspace. Perfect conditions for testing new equipment without the additional stress and chaos of heavy combat. German fighters did engage the formation over the target area, but nothing like the massive coordinated attacks that characterized missions deep into Germany. Just a few probing attacks by fighters from a nearby base, testing the formation's defenses, looking for stragglers or damaged aircraft they could isolate and destroy. But even those relatively light attacks revealed the modification's effectiveness immediately and dramatically. A Focke-Wulf 190 came in from 3 o'clock, diving down from higher altitude, the classic beam attack that had been so effective against earlier B-17 models. Patterson pivoted smoothly to track it, swinging his gun in a controlled arc, his body moving freely without obstruction, leading the target properly, just like the gunnery instructors had taught him months ago in training. Simultaneously, an Me-109 approached from 9 o'clock on the opposite side of the aircraft, trying to catch the gunners focused on the first attacker. Kowalski engaged it immediately, pivoting in his own space, tracking the second fighter independently. Both gunners moved through their full range of motion without any collision whatsoever. Their oxygen hoses stayed clear and untangled. Their ammunition belts fed smoothly from their storage containers. Their intercom cables and heated suit connections remained separate and functional. For the first time in the B-17's combat history, both waist gunners could fight simultaneously and effectively without interfering with each other, without creating the chaos and confusion that had characterized every previous engagement. Post-mission debriefing at Grafton Underwood was enthusiastic, almost euphoric. Both waist gunners reported dramatically improved operational effectiveness compared to their previous combat experience in standard aircraft. No equipment interference of any kind, no coordination difficulties, no tangled hoses or cables, no collisions during simultaneous engagements. The modification worked exactly as designed, possibly even better than the engineers had hoped. Additional test missions with the same aircraft over the following 2 weeks confirmed the initial results. Every mission, every combat engagement, every crew debriefing told the same story. The staggered waist positions were a massive improvement over the standard configuration. By August 1943, enough data existed from operational combat testing to make a definitive recommendation to higher headquarters. Implement staggered waist windows as standard equipment across all B-17 production, both new aircraft rolling off the assembly lines and older aircraft being modified at the various modification centers. But the Cheyenne team went further than just staggering the window positions. They recognized that staggering solved the collision problem and the equipment interference issues. But gunners were still working through open windows, still exposed to those hurricane-force winds and Arctic temperatures that had caused so many casualties from frostbite and cold-related injuries. The complete solution combined staggered positions with enclosed plexiglass windows featuring rotating gun mounts. Instead of a completely open hole in the fuselage, with wind screaming through at 200 miles per hour, the new configuration featured a large plexiglass window that enclosed most of the opening. The machine gun mount featured a rotating collar that allowed the gun to swivel through its full range of motion while maintaining a weatherproof seal. The gunner stood behind the enclosed window, protected from the worst of the slipstream and cold, operating the gun through the rotating mount. This complete package became known throughout the Army Air Force as the Cheyenne configuration, named after the modification center where it was developed and perfected. August 1943. 3 separate aircraft manufacturing facilities, working with remarkable coordination and speed, began implementing the Cheyenne configuration across their production lines. Douglas Aircraft incorporated staggered waist windows into their late production B-17F models first, modifying the jigs and assembly fixtures at their Long Beach plant to accommodate the new window positions. Then Boeing completed their first B-17G model on August 30th, serial number 42-31387, with staggered waist positions as standard equipment built into the aircraft from the moment the fuselage sections were assembled. Lockheed Vega's plant in Burbank followed immediately, implementing the changes within days of Boeing's first G model completion. The B-17G represented far more than just improved waist positions. It was the culmination of 2 full years of brutal combat experience, 2 years of losses and lessons, 2 years of crews identifying problems and engineers developing solutions, all incorporated into a single production design. The Bendix Chin turret, first proven on the unsuccessful YB-40 gunship program, now provided crucial frontal defense that earlier models had completely lacked. German pilots had learned that head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high received the least defensive fire from earlier B-17 models. The Chin turret eliminated that vulnerability completely. Additional cheek guns, individual 50-caliber machine gun mounts on either side of the nose section, added even more forward firepower. The tail gunner position received a complete redesign with larger windows, providing much better visibility and field of fire. improved reflector sights that made accurate shooting easier, and better ergonomics that reduced fatigue during long missions. This improved tail configuration, like the waist modifications, had been developed and tested at the Cheyenne facility before being incorporated into production aircraft. In fact, the tail modification became so closely associated with Cheyenne that crews universally referred to it as the Cheyenne tail, a nickname that appears in countless mission reports and crew memoirs. 13 50-caliber machine guns total, positioned throughout the aircraft to provide overlapping defensive coverage from every angle. Over 6,000 rounds of ammunition distributed among all the gun positions. And most critically for crew survival, a configuration that actually allowed gunners to use those weapons effectively, without fighting their own aircraft's design in addition to fighting German fighters. Production numbers revealed American industrial capacity operating at full wartime mobilization. Boeing's Seattle facilities would ultimately produce 8,680 B-17G models. Douglas Long Beach built 2095. Lockheed Vega manufactured 2,250. Total production 13,325 aircraft incorporating the Cheyenne. Modifications and other combat-driven improvements. 13,000 aircraft modified based on combat feedback, changes implemented in the middle of an ongoing war, while simultaneously maintaining and actually increasing overall production rates. The achievement was staggering. By October 1943, B-17G models began arriving in England in significant numbers, replacing the battle-weary F models that had borne the brunt of the air offensive through the terrible summer months. Combat groups transitioned their squadrons from old to new aircraft as quickly as the G models could be delivered and prepared for operations. The difference was immediately apparent to crews familiar with earlier models. Technical Sergeant Marcus Washington, an experienced waist gunner with the 91st Bomb Group, who had survived 23 missions in F-model aircraft, described his first impression of the G model in a letter that was later published in his hometown newspaper. First time I saw the new positions, I honestly thought someone was playing a practical joke on us. My window was way forward from where it had always been, much closer to the radio compartment. I looked for Joe's window on the other side and found it way aft, back toward the tail section. We stood in our positions and looked at each other across that space between us, and we both started laughing with relief. We had room, actual room to work. That sounds so simple, like such a small thing, but it was everything. Everything. I could pivot my gun without hitting Joe. I could move, turn, adjust my position without getting tangled up in his equipment. My oxygen stayed connected because nobody was stepping on the hose every 5 minutes. The enclosed plexiglass window kept most of the brutal wind off me, which meant I could actually feel my hands well enough to operate the gun properly throughout the entire mission instead of losing sensation after the first hour. He continued, "For the first time since I started flying combat missions 8 months ago, I felt like I could actually defend my aircraft the way we'd been trained to do, the way the tacticians back in the States had always claimed we could. The modification seemed so obvious once you saw it that you wondered why nobody had thought of it sooner. Why did it take 2 years of combat and hundreds of dead crewmen before someone figured out that 2 men couldn't work in the same small space without killing each other? But I'm not complaining. I'm just grateful that somebody finally solved the problem before my number came up." October 8, 1943. Major bombing raid against the port facilities at Bremen and the shipyards at Vegasack, Germany. This mission represented the first large-scale combat test of B-17G models, equipped with full Cheyenne modifications operating alongside older F models in the same formation. The comparison would be direct and unambiguous. Same mission, same target, same enemy opposition, different aircraft configurations. Statistical analysis conducted after the mission by Operational Research, Teams showed conclusively that B-17G models claimed significantly more enemy fighter kills per aircraft than F models in the same formations. More importantly, G models sustained proportionally fewer losses from beam attacks, the exact type of attack the modifications had been specifically designed to defend against. The modification was working in actual combat exactly as the engineers and test crews had predicted. October 14, 1943. The second major raid on the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. This mission would enter history with a grim nickname, Black Thursday, the single most costly air battle the 8th Air Force would ever fight during the entire war. 291 heavy bombers dispatched in the pre-dawn darkness. 60 bombers lost before the day ended. Over 600 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured in a single day's operations. The casualties were so catastrophic, so far beyond anything commanders had anticipated, that deep penetration missions into Germany without fighter escort were temporarily suspended. The entire strategic bombing campaign teetered on the edge of failure. Political pressure mounted to abandon daylight. Precision bombing in favor of joining the British in their nighttime area bombing campaign. But buried within the horror and carnage of Black Thursday lay statistical evidence that the Cheyenne modifications were making a crucial, potentially war-winning difference in bomber survivability. Post-mission analysis conducted by operational research teams, meticulous statisticians who tracked every aircraft, every loss, every type of damage, revealed a striking pattern in the data. B-17G models with full Cheyenne modifications suffered proportionally lower loss rates than older F models flying the same mission profile against the same enemy opposition. When aircraft were hit and damaged, G model crews demonstrated higher bailout survival rates because oxygen systems remained intact during combat damage, and gunners stayed conscious and functional long enough to evacuate the aircraft properly. The new waste configuration wasn't preventing aircraft losses entirely. Nothing could do that in the face of such concentrated German resistance. Hundreds of experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying the most advanced fighters in the world, attacking with suicidal determination to defend their homeland. But the modifications were improving survivability at the margins, reducing losses by perhaps 10 or 15% compared to older aircraft. And in a brutal war of attrition where victory would ultimately go to whichever side could sustain operations longer, those margins mattered enormously. Those marginal improvements meant the difference between a sustainable campaign and an unsustainable bloodbath. Captain Richard Hayes, squadron intelligence officer with the 306th Bomb Group and a former mathematics professor at Harvard before the war, documented these findings in a detailed report that was later forwarded to higher headquarters and eventually became part of the official United States Strategic Bombing Survey. We tracked every aircraft in our group, every crew position, every type of damage sustained, every loss circumstance. When we compiled the data and ran the statistical analysis, the pattern was mathematically undeniable and statistically significant well beyond any reasonable doubt. Aircraft equipped with staggered waist positions sustained fewer catastrophic hits from beam attacks than aircraft with standard opposite window configurations. When aircraft were damaged severely enough to require crew evacuation, more crew members successfully bailed out from G models than from F models, primarily because oxygen systems remained intact longer and gunners maintained consciousness and coordination during the evacuation process. The modification was saving lives even on our absolute worst day, even during the most catastrophic mission the 8th Air Force ever flew. The Luftwaffe noticed the change in American bomber defensive capabilities as well. German fighter pilot after action. Reports and intelligence summaries from autumn 1943 began noting with concern that American heavy bombers had become significantly more difficult to attack successfully from beam angles. Waist gun positions that had previously delivered irregular, uncoordinated fire were now putting out disciplined, accurate, sustained defensive fire that was much more effective at forcing attackers to break off their runs before reaching optimal firing range. Major Hans Philipp, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 1 and one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders, with over 200 confirmed aerial victories, documented the American defensive improvements in a series of detailed reports to Fighter Command Headquarters that were captured by Allied intelligence after the war. Enemy bomber defensive capabilities have improved materially over the past months. Waist gun positions now demonstrate effective coordination and sustained fire accuracy that was notably absent in earlier engagements. Previous tactical advantages our pilots enjoyed when executing beam attacks have been substantially reduced. American gunners can now track our fighters smoothly through their entire attack approach and maintain accurate fire throughout. We are suffering higher losses per engagement and achieving fewer bomber kills per sortie. Recommend development of new tactics and weapon systems to counter these improvements. This frank assessment, coming from one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced and successful combat leaders, a man who had no reason to exaggerate American capabilities and every reason to minimize them, validated completely what American crews already knew from their own experience. The modifications worked. They made a real, measurable difference in combat. They were saving American lives and forcing the Germans to adapt their tactics to counter the improvements. By December 1943, the cumulative effect of these modifications began reshaping American strategic planning at the highest command levels. The 8th Air Force could now confidently plan deeper penetration missions, knowing that their bombers had significantly improved survivability compared to just 6 months earlier. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, reported directly to General Henry Arnold, commanding general of all Army Air Forces, that defensive improvements had materially enhanced our ability to conduct sustained deep penetration strategic operations against targets throughout Germany. This wasn't just technical jargon or military bureaucracy speak. This was a direct statement that the modifications made the difference between a viable, strategic bombing campaign and an unsustainable disaster. This wasn't merely about individual bombers surviving individual missions. This was about maintaining a strategic offensive capable of achieving meaningful military objectives. The ability to fly missions week after week, month after month, steadily destroying Germany's industrial capacity to wage war. The modifications enabled the massive operations of early 1944 that would finally break the Luftwaffe's back and achieve the air superiority necessary for the eventual invasion of Europe. Big week in February 1944, 6 days of concentrated attacks against German aircraft production facilities. Over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties. Despite absolutely fierce opposition from every fighter unit the Luftwaffe could throw against the raids, losses remained sustainable. Barely. Because bombers could defend themselves effectively enough to prevent the wholesale slaughter that might have occurred 6 months earlier with older aircraft. In January 1944, Lieutenant General James Doolittle, the famous Tokyo raid leader, took command of the 8th Air Force from General Eaker. Doolittle understood that improved bomber defenses had fundamentally changed the tactical equation of daylight strategic bombing. He made a controversial decision that many officers initially opposed, but which would prove absolutely crucial to final victory. Free the escort fighters from close bomber protection duties. Previously, P-47 Thunderbolts and the new long-range P-51 Mustangs were required to stay close to bomber formations at all times, providing immediate protective coverage. Doolittle ordered them to pursue German fighters aggressively wherever they found them, to hunt them down in their assembly areas, to attack them on their airfields, to destroy them before they could even reach the bomber formations. This fundamental change in fighter employment was only possible because B-17Gs could adequately defend themselves during the periods when escorts necessarily left them to chase German formations or attack ground targets. The combination of effective bomber defenses and aggressive fighter tactics proved absolutely devastating to the Luftwaffe. German fighter losses skyrocketed through spring 1944. Experienced pilots died faster than training programs could replace them. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the daylight air war over Germany, unable to contest American bombing operations with any meaningful effectiveness. The air superiority that enabled D-Day on June 6, 1944. The key tactical air support that helped Allied ground forces break out of Normandy and drive across France. The ability to systematically destroy German oil production, transportation networks, and war industry. All of it depended fundamentally on winning the air war over Europe. And winning that air war required bombers capable of surviving long enough, in sufficient numbers, to accomplish their strategic missions. A 3-foot modification to the waist gun positions, combined with other improvements, had been one absolutely crucial piece of that larger victory puzzle. By May 1945, when the last B-17 combat mission was flown against targets in Czechoslovakia, the statistics told a dramatic story of transformation and adaptation. In early 1943, completing a 25-mission combat tour meant you had roughly a 27% chance of surviving to see home again. 1 chance in 4. Russian roulette with worse odds. By mid-1944, with B-17G models predominant in all operational squadrons, survival probability had more than doubled to over 60%. Better than even odds. Tours were actually extended to 35 missions, because enough crews were surviving their original 25 mission. Requirements that commanders needed to keep experienced. Men in combat longer. This wasn't just abstract mathematical statistics. This represented real human beings. 20-year-old waist gunners, 23-year-old pilots, 19-year-old ball turret gunners. Real people with families waiting at home, with sweethearts writing letters, with parents praying for their safe return. Going home alive instead of dying in burning aircraft over Germany, or wasting away in German prison camps, or buried in foreign soil far from home. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, the waist gunner we met at the beginning of this story, the man whose oxygen disconnected during that terrible January 1943 mission, survived the entire war. 52 combat missions total. He returned to his family in Ohio in late 1945. Married his high school sweetheart, Mary, 2 weeks after getting home, raised 3 children, worked as a precision machinist for 40 years, retired comfortably, and died peacefully in his sleep in 1998 at age 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren. He survived in large part because engineers in Cheyenne, Wyoming, people he never met, whose names he never knew, had figured out that moving a window 3 feet forward would save lives. Jean Harmon, the 19-year-old riveter who worked at the Cheyenne Modification Center, never flew in a B-17, never saw combat, never faced enemy fire, never fired a shot in anger during the entire war. But she helped save hundreds, possibly thousands of lives through her labor, through her dedication, through her refusal to accept anything less than perfect work. In that 1997 interview, recorded when she was 73 years old, near the end of her own life, she reflected on her wartime service with obvious emotion. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We were just doing a job that needed doing. We were just ordinary people trying to help win the war the best way we knew how. But sometimes, late at night, even now, I think about those boys, those young airmen, and I wonder if any of them came home because of something I did, because of a rivet I set properly, because of a bolt I tightened correctly, because of a modification I helped install with care and precision. I hope so. I really, really hope so. That would make everything worthwhile. Margaret Sullivan, who received that terrible letter on Valentine's Day, 1944, about her brother Danny's death in action, never remarried after losing her fiancé Robert to Japanese forces in the Pacific Theater later that same year. She worked as a registered nurse for 43 years, dedicating her life to healing and caring for others, perhaps trying to save other people's brothers and sons in Danny's memory. She kept Danny's photograph on her living room mantel until the day she died in 2006 at age 80. She never knew the full truth about how her brother died. Never knew that his death was caused primarily by a fundamental design flaw rather than enemy action. Never knew that his death and the deaths of hundreds of others like him had helped identify a critical problem that would eventually be solved, saving thousands of other brothers, sons, husbands, and fathers. Today, 12 B-17G flying fortresses remain airworthy worldwide, lovingly maintained by dedicated organizations and volunteers who understand their historical significance. When aviation enthusiasts and history buffs tour these magnificent aircraft at air shows and museums, guides invariably point out the staggered waist windows as an interesting design feature. Most visitors don't understand the real significance of what they're seeing. They see an interesting offset in window placement, a curious design choice, perhaps assuming it was for aerodynamic reasons or structural considerations. They don't see the culmination of brutal combat experience translated into life-saving engineering. They don't see the thousands of lives saved by that simple modification. They don't see Gene Harmon's rivets or Dewey Pui Food, Dobry Twintui, U. Erickson's calculations, or the blood. Price paid to identify the problem. Those offset windows represent something profound about how wars are actually fought and won, something that goes far beyond the simplified narratives of brilliant generals and superior technology. Wars are won through the grinding, often unappreciated process of identifying problems in the midst of chaos, developing solutions under impossible pressure, implementing changes while the fighting continues, and learning from sacrifice. Not through brilliant strategy alone, though strategy matters. Not through superior technology alone, though technology helps. But through the systematic, relentless process of adaptation, improvement, and refinement driven by the people actually doing the fighting and the people supporting them. The B-17 flying fortress that helped win World War II, that helped achieve air superiority over Europe, that helped make D-Day possible, that helped destroy Nazi Germany's capacity to wage war, wasn't the aircraft that started the war. It wasn't the bomber that rolled off Boeing's assembly line in 1941. It was transformed, continuously improved through the blood price paid by crews who identified its flaws in the hardest school imaginable, modified by engineers who developed solutions under tremendous pressure, built by workers who implemented changes across thousands of aircraft while the war still raged. Danny Sullivan died because his oxygen line disconnected in a space too confined for two men to work safely. His death, and the deaths of hundreds of others like him, forced American engineers to confront a fundamental design flaw they'd missed during development. The solution was measured in feet. 3 feet forward, 3 feet aft, that's all it took. Just 3 feet of offset between gun positions. But those 3 feet represented the difference between chaos and coordination, between confusion and effectiveness, between suffocation and survival, between death and life. Simple modifications, profound results, victory through adaptation. This is the real story of how America won the air war over Europe.